Well, it's now 10:30, and it's time for Brainstorming the Human Connection, brought to you by the South Dakota Humanities Council. My name is Lawrence Diggs, and I will be your host and inquisitor for the guest. And this is an interactive program. It's what we like to think sets it apart from other kind of programs because it's not only the talking heads like myself and my guest, but also all of you. So we're looking forward to your participation. If you have questions, if you have comments, if you've had uh, different experiences that you can share, then we'd love to hear those things. And this is a place where we can have a, at least that's our intention, is to have civil discussions, and people can agree and without being disagreeable, So we like to think that we put our ideas out there, and then if other people, it's not so much that other people agree or not, it's not a popularity contest, but we're just throwing ideas out, and then we can all learn something from seeing something maybe from your point of view, and that often happens when we have different points of view. One of the things that I've heard people say, and I've seen in action really, is we often have trouble trying to find a way to connect with other people. And we have these imaginary lines between cultures and so-called races and religions and, you know, various invisible, they're invisible and they're imaginary, but we create lines. And then we find that they're kind of like those electric uh, things that they put on dogs, and if they go past a certain place, they'll get a shock, you know. But we have a hard time crossing those barriers. And my guest today is a person who actually crossed such a barrier. And we're going to be talking about the power, the strength it takes to do that, and also the power in doing it. What do you get out of it? And he's the author of a book entitled The Boy Who Promised Me Horses. And his name is David Charpentier. David, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Let's start off, David, by having you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you were born, and uh, you know, kind of experiences you grew up in, and then we'll get to the book.
Okay, I grew up in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Was born in the late 60s. And the one thing about St. Cloud that that I remember, and I just drove down the street I grew up on just this week while I'm back in Minnesota visiting, is that hardly anybody moved out of our homes. Um, and still there's still people living there from 40 years ago. The same people. So it was kind of like your classic, all American city that I grew up in. And my dad was a high school teacher, high school social studies teacher. Um, and I believe that one of the reasons why when I first moved to the reservation community in Montana, that I had a hard time with the transition was that I didn't find the same type of neighborhood that I had in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Um, it was a middle class neighborhood where, like I said, people didn't move out of their homes. Nobody got divorced. The moms didn't work. And when I ended up at St. Lebray in the village where I lived, it was a much different situation. So it was not just the physical landscape that was different, it was also the social landscape that was different as well.
You have written The Boy Who Promised Me Horses, and I understand it's about the loss of a close friend. I mean, it starts that let's say that it turns around that, but it's about a lot more. Tell us about how you came to write the book, and what you intended to do by writing the book and having people read it.
So when I first got to St. Lebray in 1990, I had only intended on being there for 1 year. When I graduated from St. John's University in Minnesota and began looking for teaching jobs, they were hiring. There was couldn't find a teaching job in Minnesota. And when I was in college, and when I transferred from being a science major to an English major, a friend of mine said to me, "What are you going to do with an English degree?" And I blurted out, "I'm going to teach on a reservation in Montana." And I don't know where that came from. It just came out of nowhere, I guess, out of my subconscious. But after I graduated, I kind of tried to avoid, I didn't apply to any jobs in Montana at all, only in Minnesota. Until one day I grew desperate enough and I found the advertisement for St. Lebray. And I filled out my resume and cover letter, mailed it in, and I received an application packet in the mail, which I ignored and ignored and ignored until one day the director of schools called me on the phone and said, "We have your resume and cover letter. Are you going to fill out the application?" And I lied kind of and said, "Well, I'm planning on it." But I had been beaten down by rejection, and I was at that point not really planning on filling out the application. So I asked him if I could just come out for an interview. And I thought he'd be happy to, invite me out. And he paused and he said, "We need your application first before we schedule an interview." So then I lied to him. This was a direct lie. And I said, "I'm planning on a trip out west. Can I just stop by?" And he said, after a really long pause, "I guess that would be okay." So I packed up and left the next morning, completed my application at the rest area, and then interviewed for the job. And then 2 days later, they called and offered it to me. And I realized I had no other option than to accept it. But I still, when I went there after my first year, I was certain I was going to leave. And then after my second year, I was certain I was going to leave. And then I ended up staying for 4 years. And then I decided I have to find a way to leave Ashland. I felt restless. I felt like I wasn't accomplishing, what I wanted to do in life. And so I went away to graduate school in Missoula, Montana, and never thought I would see Ashland again. I never thought I'd see my friend Maurice Prairie Chief again. And while I was living in Missoula, I ran into an old friend of mine named Elaine Littlebird, and she had worked at St. Lebray the first 4 years I was there. We weren't friends, we were acquaintances, but in Missoula, she became my best friend. And she visited me often. And over Christmas break, I told her I was going back to Ashland for a quick visit on my way to Minnesota. And I wanted to buy a Christmas present for this young boy. And I asked her if she had an idea for a good Christmas present. And she said, "Well, who is it for?" And she told me this, or I told her it was for Maurice Prairie Chief. And she said, "I know Maurice Prairie Chief." And she said, "When I was a teacher's aide in the elementary school, the teacher would always send Maurice to me because he wouldn't do his work." And one day I said, "Maurice, what is going on?" And he said, "If my best friend Dave was here, I would do my work." And so when Elaine Lillibird told me that Maurice called me his best friend, I decided I would return to Ashland the next year, even though I decided I was never coming back. And I had a job offer at that point in a town in near Missoula. But instead of taking that job, I decided to go back to Ashland, back to St. Lebray, back to Maurice to see if I could make a difference in his life. Because Maurice never said thank you. He never seemed to appreciate that I could tell, the things that we did. He didn't say, "Thanks for taking me fishing." When I left, he didn't say, "Are you coming back?" And some other teachers even told me, "Maurice is just using you." But now I knew that he called me his best friend. And so I thought that I could then, with that knowledge, change his life. So then the story resumes when I returned to Ashland, and things did not go as I had planned. And I think that the confusion I felt, the helplessness I felt, but tremendous connection I made with Maurice compelled me to try to write this book to try to figure out what it all meant. And you mentioned that, you know, Maurice passes away. And in my book, I tell the readers of his passing in the very first sentence of the book. So the book becomes not about his death, but about his remarkable life. And then I take the readers on a journey to figure out and try to answer some of the other harder questions. What did our relationship mean? Why did my relationship not seem to change the trajectory of his life? What kind of meaning then can we assign or evaluate for a life that ended up, you know, in tragedy, things like that. And mostly I wrote the books just so I could explore those feelings in myself because I felt like I didn't quite understand. And the journey of writing this book made me realize that I loved him like a son.
Let's talk a bit about your transition. You know, as you said, you know, you came from quite a different environment than the reservation
Yes.
environment. Can you talk about what changed in you or what caused the change?
Yeah, it's interesting in the book that the some of the uncomfortableness I felt when I first got to Ashland is evident in the physical description. It was hot, it was dusty, there were lots of abandoned homes, and I had come from a really green Minnesota with lakes. And there was a first fishing trip that Maurice came over one day, just knocked on my door and asked me if I wanted to go fishing. He didn't ask me to take him fishing. He said, "Do you want to try fishing?" And so then in this fishing trip, there's this kind of um, conflict of our fishing styles. He had worms in a styrofoam cup, and he was trying to catch catfish and carp. And I had a whole tackle box full of expensive lures, and I would fish for walleyes and bass. And when I fished, we were in a boat with a cooler full of Coke and cookies. And on this trip, um, we leave the Saint Libre mission, and Maurice starts giving me directions. And it wasn't very long before I realized I had no idea where we were going. And I have this line in my book that says we were heading deeper into the res, like it was this some dark place, you know, of unknown. And and then during that day, there are some slight descriptions of the scenery where I describe in a way that it makes the scenery seem beautiful. And it was kind of slowly my acceptance, like this environment is, you know, beautiful, and it kind of mirrors my relationship with Maurice as we become closer. But during that day, though, the fishing day, nothing went well. We didn't catch any fish. Maurice wanted to try all my expensive lures, and one of the lures is this hula popper lure, which I described that Maurice wanted to try this hula popper. And that it's interesting because the other day when I was meeting with that men's book club, all of them knew what the hula popper was. They all loved that lure when they were kids. So Maurice was fascinated by this lure, and I didn't let him use it because I was afraid he would snag it on a tree and break it. And what's so ironic is that the last line of the story, Maurice says something like, "Hey Dave, I didn't lose none of your lures, huh?" And then I say on an aside to the reader, "But I did. I lost my brand new hula popper."
Yeah,
So
life turns that way on you
yeah.
sometimes.
So then the next, so some of the other adventures though, then when Maurice and I go fishing, there's this evolution of how I describe the scenery. What Maurice and I are looking at outside our windows becomes to be the same thing. And we go fishing at this place called Crazy Head Springs, which was kind of our magical place where we would disappear and go fish. And you know, I describe the ponds that we fished in and the fish that we caught, and just our adventures. And there's this transition, you know, away from me having these expectations that we need to be fishing for walleyes in a boat. And I described quite a few scenes of Maurice's facial expressions using fishing analogies, like a smile broke from the corner of his mouth and rippled to his ear. So it kind of mirrors, a fish coming to the water to the surface to eat. So those were some of the transitions I made. And then also the people in the community were so welcoming to invite teachers to participate in activities like sweat lodges and peyote meetings. And it was wonderful. It was a wonderful gift from them. And as long as you were interested, they invited you, every single time. And so that was part of my transition to as well. The part that did not go well of my experience at the beginning was my teaching part. I felt like teaching was a struggle. I felt like teaching was a challenge. Like I wasn't very good. So the parts with hanging out with Maurice and going on our adventures, and then being involved in community activities like powwows and sweats and peyote meetings, then balanced the part of the teaching that was not going so well.
Mhm. So it sounds like you had quite a few adventures with Maurice. Can you give us a couple of 50,000-foot views of some of those interesting, salient adventures that you had with Maurice?
Sure. And one thing I wanted to describe now is when Maurice and I would go off on our adventures, Maurice called them our us guys stories. He would often then summarize these stories days or years afterwards. He'd always say, "Hey, Dave, remember that one time when us guys?" And then he would go on to tell the story. And a friend of mine who read my book, he was a professor of literature. He described these us guys stories as my ability to evoke the spirit of play and adventure. And he said, I call those the Maurice effect.
Mm.
And so I went back and looked at all the passages where we go on these adventures, and there's imagery that I use where it shows us kind of disappearing. We left the reservation behind, we left the stress of my classroom behind, and we would play games, and we would climb rocks, we'd ride horses, we'd fish. And some of the games were simple things like we found this one area where the entire hillside, the trees had been knocked down in a windstorm. And we would try to walk to the top of the hill without touching the ground, going from rock to rock. And Maurice was, always making up new rules for us. Well, we could do it, but we had 3 lives that we could do or use, and we could step on rocks if they were the size of basketballs. And he was the leader in all those types of games that we played, and he was so good at balancing, so athletic that I had a hard time keeping up, even though I was an athlete as well. And that contrasted to some of the things that I noticed when he was at the school or in the village community. Um, his friends later told me that he was picked on during school. He wasn't very confident in his classes, but when we were on our adventures, he was the bass master. He could have climbed the half dome with no ropes. He was such a good climber. And one of my favorite adventures with Maurice um, was when I took him skating at Crazy Head Springs. And this is in a remote lake up at the top of the divide. So it's 1,000 feet higher than the town of Ashland or the town of Lame Deer. They call it the divide. It's between Ashland and Lame Deer. It's a beautiful area with pine trees. And there were a few lakes called Crazy Head Springs. And I took him there to skate. And I imagine we may be the only people who've ever skated there, although I'm not certain. But I haven't heard of anybody skating there, in the 30 years since I moved there. And Maurice wore my skates. I had extra skates. He used the stick that I used in my very last hockey game of my college career. And he improved by the hour when he skated. Like he just got better and better. He even challenged me to a game of one-on-one. And there's this moment where we're sitting on the ice. We're lying on the ice. We're looking up and we notice the trees are moving, the ponderosa pine are swaying. And we have this conversation about trees and about, did you ever notice trees swaying when you were lying on the ice before? And I say, no, I've never looked at trees when I'm lying down on the ice. And um, it was just kind of this magical moment. And I remember looking around then at the bank of the pond and seeing like where we were when, we were fishing. And there was this moment where I felt like we were looking out at our lives. And but from where we were on the ice together, I felt like we were living the truest forms of ourselves. Like this was what our lives were meant to have been. And where we were when we were back in the village, back in the classroom, we weren't quite living the best life that we could. Um, but together, when we were on our adventures, then we were living our truest forms of ourselves. And I think that's what the professor was talking about when he said it was the Maurice effect. That
Right.
time and place that we created for each other, where we belong together. That's how
Right.
we made our connection.
I think the story or the line that you said when Maurice asked you, have you ever noticed the trees swaying? For a boy to ask anybody that, particularly another man, that's deep,
Yeah.
because they're asking you to see something to help you to discover, and through their eyes, that's a particularly close, it signals a particularly close relationship on a very deep level. The vulnerability of that is profound, but also just the trusting and wanting you to experience something that he experienced. I'm going to turn and take a break now for the in our conversation to give the audience a chance to uh, weigh in on maybe some experiences that they've had with a child or with anyone else that brought them into a space where they could actually explore life with another person through and share eyes, so to speak. It doesn't have to be limited to that, but that's a start anyway. Anybody have any questions, comments? Do, 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 do. Okay, well, we'll keep going. And if anybody has a comment or a question or something, there is that react button down in the bottom, or raise your hand, or something like that to chime in. Because as I said at the top of the program, this is an interactive program, and that's what we want to give people every opportunity to become part of the conversation. It's active rather than passive. So with these adventures, David, we have a chance to share something together and to get to know each other. Can you talk about that process? How have you found that doing things with people uh, gives you an opportunity to actually uh, experience them and get to know them?
Well, in my relationship with Maurice, um, I described it as, we created time and place for each other. And I think that can be used by any person who is trying to love the people around them, um, whether it's their spouse or friends or just their neighbors. And for Maurice, it was adventures that we went on, but that could be metaphorical. So it doesn't have to be going fishing. It could just be being in the room with someone and being attentive to them. But I also think that the metaphor of the spirit of play and adventure also translates into it has to be, a kind of special moment that you're creating with these people. And that's when you develop connections or bonds that strengthen your relationship, that you can use then when you're in situations that aren't spirit of play and adventure, because not all of our connections or relationships are what I call like the easy moments. So for Maurice and me, the moments out in the hills climbing, that came easy for us because that's what we were good at. But then in my relationship with Maurice, we also had some very hard moments, and I call those the hard doorway moments. And there were a number of passages in my book that take place in driveways when I'm saying goodbye, or in doorways where we have these hard conversations. And one of the first ones that I describe is the day I tried to say goodbye to Maurice after 4 years, when I was heading to Missoula, and I never thought I'd see him again. And we went on one last adventure. And so during that last adventure, we just went out to the hills and we were looking for these carvings that I heard rumors about, and we didn't find any carvings, but we did some hiking. But I was looking for this perfect moment, in our spirit of play and adventure, where everything would just kind of make sense and I could go about saying goodbye to him. And it didn't happen. And I describe it as like, our last day together was not anything unusual, just was kind of the same type of adventure. And I'm not sure what I was looking for. And then when I dropped him off, then I tried to say goodbye. And before I could even get it out, he said, see ya, which is what they say on the res instead of goodbye, because goodbye they feel is too permanent. And then he started asking me questions about what I was going to do later that night and different things. And I realized, like, this goodbye is not going how I planned. I wasn't able to tell him what he meant to me.
Mm.
And so then, when I left Ashland and came back, then I thought, okay, so now that I know he called me his best friend, then I'm truly gonna make this difference in his life. And we continue to have our adventures, but we continue to find ourselves back in those hard doorway moments as well. And one day, Maurice, it was the day before Maurice was supposed to go into the St. Lebre group home. We decided that the safest place for Maurice, because his grandma was old, was to have him live in the St. Lebre group home, which we had children from all over Montana would live there who were in foster care or court ordered there. And Maurice was terrified to go. And so we went on one last adventure. And then when I dropped him off, he asked me if I could make it so he didn't have to go into the group home. And we had this intense conversation where he actually yelled at me and told me I didn't want to help him. And so what I talk about in my book is that as human beings who are trying to love others, if we don't establish that connection through our spirit of play and adventure, then our relationships do not survive those hard doorway moments, because they're so challenging. It's hard to know sometimes what emotion you're feeling, and it's even harder to say the right things. And so I felt that if Maurice and I hadn't established that strong connection, we never would have made it to those hard doorway moments. And I challenge my audiences now when I go to my presentations that when you get in those hard doorway moments, remember the Maurice effect. Remember the time that you put in with this relationship and the connection you made, and that will help you then to understand what you're feeling, and ultimately it will help you say the important things that need to be said, because a lot of times we feel like those things are too hard to say. And so I encourage people to use the Maurice effect to say those hard things before it's too late, and they don't
I'd like,
have time.
I'd like to get a little bit into the weeds, actually, of the Maurice effect, because it, it it may not be clearly understood. I'm not sure I clearly understand it.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit more about what that is and what kind of investment that takes to create that?
Well, the Maurice effect, yeah, is a term that my friend Dr. David Craig used to describe the spirit of play and adventure that Maurice and I went on. And for us, it was, literally we would go on adventures together. And these adventures were, usually out into the hills around Ashland, and involved climbing, rock, fishing, riding horses. But it doesn't have to be, out in the hills. It could be, just moments when with your partner or your friends or your wife, husband, where you just create time and place for each other. You could just be sitting in your backyard talking, um, but without distractions. It could be, going for a walks, listening to vinyl records with your friends. But you're creating space for that person that maybe doesn't exist in their lives. One of I include an epigraph in my book by the poet Rilke that says, "Each blind lurch of the world leaves its disinherited, to whom no longer the past and not yet the future belong." And I think all of us feel that truth in our lives to some extent. It doesn't apply just to some people. I think we all feel times in our life where we don't belong, where we feel out of place. We feel like maybe our aspirations aren't coming true, or our dreams haven't been fulfilled, or we're wondering where we fit into the world and with other people. And if you can create time and place for those people, then you can balance the blind lurch that Rilke writes about. And you can create, a time and place where that person belongs with you. And I think that goes a long way in bonding and strengthening your friendship, but it also creates confidence in those people, makes them feel fulfilled, um, and it's a healthy place for people to be. And then once you leave those moments of spirit and adventure and play, because while we all have to leave those moments, we can't live in those places all the time. But once you leave those, then you're better equipped then to deal with those hard doorway moments that I talk about, where life is challenging and relationships are challenging. Um, and that's what I felt with my relationship with Maurice. Kept getting stronger and stronger as.
So are you still there? It looks like
I'm still here.
Your picture locked up.
Your picture locked up.
Are you there?
I'm there. Yep.
Are we on?
Hello. What?
See you. I can see both of you and hear you.
I think you're okay to continue, David. I think Lawrence might be having some technical issues.
Lawrence is frozen on my screen.
He's
Okay.
completely gone for me. So yeah, I think you're okay.
I am now the taking over as the host of the show. Does anybody have any questions or comments or experiences they would like to share?
I had a question.
Yes.
We were talking about your relationship with a young boy and what kind of experiences you had together. You became bonded in that experience in such a way that it's almost like you're fulfilling a parental role. And I find that very interesting because the parental role for many Native children, and I being myself a Native person, I find that sometimes there's just so much distraction in the lives of the young people that it's very difficult for bonding to happen in a way that carries them into adulthood. I was just listening to a program, and I was just curious, have you read Richard Powers' book, Playground?
No, I have not.
It's very interesting because we have, it's a novel, but he's talking about the kind of relationships that are growth experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And you're talking about the Maurice effect for a spiritual bonding of sorts. Um, when we're talking about that in a context of mixed cultures, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
um, I find it from my own experience that lots of young people and non-native people come into the native community, and the native people are very open to receiving these outsiders.
Yeah.
And I'm not quite sure. Um, there's two things going on in my head here regarding that question. The one is that when we're put into a setting and there is not necessarily a reception on the part of the, like a boarding school or mission school, that's a different kind of experience, even though some of those settings are all about spirit. And then you have the other situation where outsiders are coming into our community, and we receive them in ways that are, well, they're not the kind of experiences that you would have oftentimes. I just talked to my brother not too long ago about this very same thing, because um, we were wondering why it is that it's so easy for our native communities to embrace outsiders.
Mm-hmm.
It's so difficult for us to be embraced in non-native settings. So you're talking about your growth actually when you're writing your story. You're talking about your experience in a setting where you are not a part of that community from your life stories.
Yeah.
And so when you're looking at your own experience there, have you thought about how your presence there um, is filling some kind of need, or because you're telling your story, and
Yeah.
you're calling it the Maurice effect because you grew out of it, and you're also experiencing it, witnessing that there is no really good word for goodbye in our culture, you know.
Yeah.
So when you're thinking about that bond that you built, um, have you thought about how, now I haven't read your book, but your book is very much like so many others that are similar to your experience
Mm-hmm.
by non-native people. And it's the author who always seems to come across as being the one who has had an awakening moment spiritually,
Mm-hmm.
visitation to the native community. Um, I guess my question is, what's your thoughts on how the young people and others, um, how you fit into that setting?
Yeah. There's lots of layers to, my experience and in my interaction with the setting at St. Labray and on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. But one of the things that someone who read my book said that they felt, the most important part of my book was our friendship, and that the, reservation community or setting was almost secondary. And so I feel like Maurice and I had a connection based more on our personalities and how we were similar, that there wasn't really like I don't feel like I came into Maurice's life and fulfilled a void that he had, that he wasn't getting somewhere else, as much as we were just people that really connected. And so we went on these adventures. We were, you know, it was probably like a big brother type connection. I wouldn't say that I was fulfilling his role as a parent. Um, and so I feel like that it wasn't necessarily me, coming in and saving Maurice or fulfilling something that was missing in him, rather than just two people that had a connection that was remarkable, and it could happen between two people in other countries and other situations as well. I guess I'm not sure if that answers your question or not, or if that makes sense to you.
Well, I'm thinking about all the many young children who are adopted into other cultures from our reservation. We even
Yeah.
have a law now to protect the
Yeah,
well-being of our young people.
yeah,
When you're young, you're very much interested in the world. You have lots
yeah.
of curiosity about how things happen, who these people are, what they're doing, how does that affect me, or not even necessarily how it affects you, but
Mhm,
your curiosity is such that um, you're open and vulnerable. And
mhm.
that's what I'm getting across is that these young people are very open and vulnerable. I years ago read a book that it was a very terrible outcome there. So I'm kind of anxious to read your book. It was called, let me see here. It was written by Michael Doris, called A Yellow Raft in Blue Water.
Yeah, I have read that book. Yeah,
And then there is the stories that came about as a result of Adam's life with Michael Doris.
yeah,
And that's particular story is it's a common story, let's put it that way. And adoption is part of that process of the common story. So
Mhm,
I'm anxious to read what you have to say, because we don't often hear of the kind of relationships that are um, fulfilling somebody's need,
mhm.
and your reference to spirit is heavily layered. And so your tone about what your story is all about is leading me to the direction of examining the relationship that you two had, because we have so many others that are not healthy.
Yeah,
So that's my comment there.
yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not telling you that you have to read my book. But if you did read it, I'd be interested in, you know, hearing your reflection upon it afterwards. And when I use the word spirit of play and adventure, I'm not talking so much about like a spiritual awakening for me or a religious, just this, in the spirit of play and adventure, um, you know, kind of meaning that when we would, go off and go fishing, then there was, we were kind of leaving things behind us, and we were creating this time that was, for each other, that I think were gifts to both of us in these moments. But in my time at St. Libre, when you'll read in my book, I was very aware of, the role of the church at St. Libre in the past and at other boarding schools. And so I was, cognizant of, you know, my role was not to make students Catholic, not to encourage students to become Catholic. In fact, I encourage them to explore and to get in close, in touch or strengthen their own cultural beliefs and practices. And one of the things that I wanted for Maurice all the time was I wanted him to be engaged more with, you know, drumming at powwows, dancing at powwows in his own culture, because he didn't have a dad or a grandpa or uncles who were introducing him to those things at all. And in fact, there was nobody in the community that was actively helping Maurice be engaged in his culture. And I didn't feel that was my place to do, but I was looking or hoping that someone would then have that kind of connection with Maurice and his culture as well.
David, while we wait to see if we can get Lawrence back in the conversation here, I did want to touch base with you and ask about the Bridge Foundation, the nonprofit that you founded in, I think, 2003, I think.
Yes.
What is the Bridge Foundation and how did that come about? How did you get that off the ground?
Well, at about that time in 2000, I was working for St. Libre. And St. Libre has a scholarship program for our college graduates or our high school graduates who go to college. So every student who graduates from St. Libre is entitled to a scholarship for college. And not just for 1 year, but through their graduation from college. But then we have, there were lots of summer program opportunities for students to go on. Like one of them is called College Horizons, which is a camp where students meet in the summer, and the top colleges around the country help them with the admissions process. And there were fees to go, there were transportation costs and tuition costs for those things. And there were other summer programs that I thought students could benefit from: science camps, math camps, leadership camps. And so I started to look at ways to support those costs. And then I decided the best way would be to start my own nonprofit foundation and raise money through grants to help students to attend those summer programs. And in recent years, I've been partnering with some of the former students that I've mentored, and I've named them to the executive board of my foundation and to the director roles. And so they've been writing their own grants, and we have several grants going on both the Northern Cheyenne and Crow Reservation right now. Most recently, a grant by a young woman named Cammie Jo Whiteclay, and it's on Crow storytelling and the importance of storytelling. And we received a $20,000 grant for her. So I'm trying to foster young leaders in the communities, and with a cultural and educational leadership roles. And at this point, I just manage the money, and I tell students, if you have an idea that you think you can do to help promote your culture on your reservation, then I will find a grant opportunity for us and help you write it. There's a question. Yes?
What did happen to Maurice? And also, where do the horses come in? Or the horse? I can't remember the title.
Yeah. So when Maurice was 17, he left Ashland mysteriously. And this wasn't the first time that he would leave. There were other times when I would go to his house, to pick him up or do something, and they would say, well, he's in South Dakota now. And another time he moved to Riverton, Wyoming to live with his sister and her boyfriend's family. And that lasted maybe about a month. And then Maurice called me and said, my sister's boyfriend beats me up every day. So I drove to Riverton, Wyoming and picked him up and brought him back. So when he left when he was 17, no one really knows why he left. And he ended up moving to Missouri with an older brother, and that I didn't even know, he had this older sibling. And one day I talked to him on the phone once, and he said he wanted to come home. And so I sent him money to buy a plane ticket or a bus ticket. And then several weeks later, he was hit by a train and killed. And all I heard was that he got drunk and tried to outrun a train. That was the story that was told. And so in 2010, I Googled his name and then train accident, the name of Missouri, and then death. And I pressed return, and it was the first story that appeared was an archive of the Jefferson City, Missouri newspaper. And it was a 71-word story about his death. And I found out a few things. He wasn't driving the vehicles. Someone else was driving, which is really important to me. And I found a few other details out, but it left me with more questions. And so that was the beginning of the book for me. I read that article and then wrote my reaction to it. And then I just started writing from there. And I kind of took the readers back in time and, to the first day I met him, with kind of the goal of trying to figure out, the whys, like, why did he end up in Missouri? Why did he seem to have a path that, was, not changed by my friendship with him? And what did our relationship mean? And the horses come in. One day he told me that he was going to chase wild horses. And many of the things he told me were, hard to, comprehend based on the differences of how we grew up. In this case, his grandma didn't have a car, didn't have a truck, they didn't have any land. And so I skipped all those questions, but I said, what are you going to do if you catch a wild horse? Because he didn't have a place to put it. And he told me that his grandma told him, if I catch 2 horses, I have to give 1 to you. And so that's how the title of the book came about. And then he also sometimes would ride horses for this friend of his, and he would tell me he was breaking horses, and he told me he would bring me a horse to ride. And he one day showed up in my front yard and woke me up in the morning by knocking on my window. And when I looked out my window, he was sitting on a horse. And then he took me riding, and that year he had the horse for almost a year, just in a picket line by his house. And he'd bring it over and he'd make me try to gallop it. And I have a story about all the times I tried to run and would fall off until finally once I stayed on. So that's how the title came about, The Boy Who Promised Me Horses, because of the times he promised me horses. And if you can see the poster behind me, that's Maurice Prairie Chief on the horse Dudley that he brought me to ride.
It sounds as if the world he needed is not in existence, or the world that he longed for, or the world that he was put into, or I don't know. It's a sad story. He tried to make a lot of it, though, a lot out of it, out of his world. Did the best he could, I think, especially with the horse.
Yeah.
That was a wonderful thing to happen.
It's definitely has a sad ending to it. And I'm hoping that, my book is a celebration of the years that he was alive. And that's what people take away from it. And that he was more than just, the view of him as a student at St. Lebray, where he was a student who didn't do his work. His life, was beautiful, and he had many gifts to give, and I was lucky enough to be part of that for the brief life that he had. And if his life can be an inspiration for others, to make strong connections with people, and have compassion for people, then I think that it has the ability to change lives and improve people's lives and improve our relationships with each other. Does anybody else have a question or a comment? Thank you for your question.
Welcome.
Are you working on any other works right now?
I am working on some short stories and a novella, but none of these take place at St. Lebray, and they're fiction. So I'm kind of moving in the direction of my next work will be a fictional piece, and not set at St. Lebray or on the reservation community. But at this point, writing this book was took me 10 years from when I started to write to get it published. So the next book, writing another book, it seems like a daunting task at this point. And right now I'm enjoying just the process of sharing this book with other people. And each time I do present it and talk about it with people, there are things about the book that I didn't even know were in there. that I'm still discovering and exploring. And so that's my excuse for not writing more right now, is that I'm too busy talking to people about this book.
So Mike, that brings me to like the thought I had about how difficult is it to kind of switch gears to writing something new or something different, something fictional after such a profoundly personal, emotional journey in writing this book over 10 years.
Yeah, that was a conversation I had recently. You know, in a way, the person asking the question was wondering if the type of book that I wrote was a hindrance to what I'm trying to write now. And I am having problems in my head thinking my writing will never be as good as this book because of how emotionally invested I was. And just in order to write this book and to hear his voice again and to get the details, I would try to get myself into those memories. And the way I did that was by describing the setting, the smells, the sounds, the textures of things. And the more I could put myself back in those settings, the more I could feel the emotions. And the more I could feel the emotions, the more I could hear his voice. And my writing became better and the story became better. And so then I'm wondering, well, if I'm writing a fictional piece, how can I ever be engaged enough to get my writing to that level? Which is, I think, you know, the good fiction writers are brilliant because they can make themselves do that. I don't consider myself to be a brilliant writer, so I'm still a long ways away from being able to do things like that, I think. Although I'm going to try, but what happened to Lawrence?
I haven't seen him come back yet.
No,
Has this ever happened before?
I think one time early on it happened. So who knows what weird technological things are going on. So, hi David, it's nice to see you again.
Hi.
I was gonna say that this seems like the question that you grapple with in the book, and you kind of made this point a little bit before. It's sort of the universal question that I think almost everyone asks when they lose someone, you know, what could I have done? What did I miss? What could have changed?
Yeah.
Is that something you found in your presentations? Do people come to you then with their stories and say, I lost so and so, or whatever it might be, and here's the way that my feelings were similar to yours? Or
I'm sorry, there's a lawnmower going by my
Oh.
What was your question?
So I'm just wondering whether you get that reaction from audiences. Do people tell you their stories then of loss and questioning?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my experience is, you know, definitely transferable to other people's lives, which I think, you know, is the importance of literature is, you know, we read something and we say, how can I apply this to my life? How did this impact my life? Where do I compare in my journey through life to these experiences? So I have had people tell me the same thing. And in fact, one young woman who St. Lambert graduate that I've mentored, and she read the book and she said that she related to me. She said, we all have people that we've tried to love and we could not help. And then she went on to tell me that she said, now I know why you never gave up on us in my mentoring program. And then she thanked me for all the things that I did for her life that I had not even really remembered. And she said, you weren't able to change the trajectory of Maurice's life, but you were able to change the trajectory of my life. And then she thanked me for that. And so I think when people do talk about, like, I've had the same experience, but the message is, you don't just say, well, it didn't end well, so it wasn't worth it. But the message is, you have to keep trying, because sometimes the ending is positive, and you can never underestimate the impact of the smallest gesture of kindness. And even in people ask me, like in Maurice's life, like, was it a waste? What is it a waste? You know what? And my time with Maurice was a gift to me. And Maurice, I would never say that Maurice's life was, not worth his living, even though he passed away, at 17. And if people can, like I said, treat each other with more compassion and try harder to create connections, then his life is even more powerful than we can imagine.
And we have Lawrence back just in time to wrap up, right?
Were you in Twilight Zone?
Can you hear me? My microphone keeps going back on and off. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't know what happened. It just suddenly everything froze. And then I tried to get out and tried to get back in, and I called Stacy, but her number was going to voicemail. So anyway, it just magically came back. I tried 2 or 3 backup systems, they didn't work either. But anyway, thank you for being with us, David. And we
you.
hope we'll have you. Sorry, the technical thing, but things happen. That's the way it works on the internet. Thanks everybody for showing up, and we'll see you next week. Same time, same station.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.